Welcome to the Listening Time podcast. I'm Herson with polyclosa.com, and you're listening to episode 1, and this is Listening Time podcast. This podcast is for listening English learner who want to practice their English listening. This is a good resource for you if you're not able to understand real English speed and but you're more advanced than just a low beginner level. If that's your case, then this is a great podcast for you. So today in this introduction episode, I'm gonna talk to you about a few things. I'm gonna talk to you about a format of this podcast. I'm gonna explain how it works and the structure of it, and I'm gonna talk to you about how do you use this podcast, how it can be most beneficial to you, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about me, Herson. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So let's get to it. Are your ears ready? You know what time it is. It's listening time. All right, so first, let's talk about a format of this podcast. This podcast will air on Monday and Wednesday and Friday. At least that's how I plan to air the podcast right now. But most likely it will be 3 days a week. So you should have plenty of podcasts to use to practice your listening, and each podcast will be about 25 minutes in length. Some of them might be shorter and some of them might be longer, but in general, each podcast will be somewhere around 25 minutes long. So you have a pretty long podcast and a lot of materials to practice your listening. So, in each podcast, I'm planning on talking about 2 or 3 different topics each time. For example, maybe today I want to talk about travel and food, or maybe tomorrow I want to talk about cars or other everyday routine topics. Really, I'm gonna talk about everything. So hopefully the topic will be interesting for you, and they'll be new each time, and it will be a good research for you overall. I'm gonna speaking very clear as I can. You can hear an example of that with this intro podcast. I'm speaking pretty clear, right? My voice is relatively easy to understand, easier than most native speakers. And so I'm gonna speaking pretty clearly, and I'll be speaking just a little bit more slowly than I will normally speak with other Americans or other native speakers. So I'm not speaking really slowly, but I'm speaking just a little bit more slowly and a little bit more clear and in average of American. So with each podcast, you will also have access. The transcript will you will understand all the words and the phrases you missed. First, remember, maybe you listen to me right now. You can understand most of what I'm saying, but not everything, and so the transcript will help you filling the gaps for those missing words, missing phrases, etc. The transcript will be auto-generated, so they won't be perfect. I'll try to edit them a little bit before uploading them, but honestly, I probably won't have the time to edit all of the mistakes and scripts, but hopefully there won't be too many. So that would be a great resource for you as well to help you with this podcast. So now let's talk about how to use this podcast. So first of all, who's this podcast for? Who should be listening to the Listening Time podcast? Well, ideally, if you have an English level of lower intermediate or higher beginning, this is probably a good resource for you. For example, if you have an A2 level of English or a B1 of language, this would be perfect for you to practice with. However, if you have a higher level, that let's say a B2 level, that's okay. You can use this podcast to help you understand even better, to help you improve your listening. It should be a good tool. Undoubtedly, certain words or phrases that are new to you. So even if you can understand 95% of what I'm saying, this podcast should still be a good resource for you because of the sheer amount of this vocabulary that you'll hear during this podcast. And on the other side, if you have an A1 level, this podcast will probably will be too difficult for you. I'm not speaking very slowly. I'm speaking a little slow, but not very slowly, and I'm gonna be using normal vocabulary that I would normally use with other native speakers. So if you are at a lower beginning level, like A1 or maybe very low A2 level, this might be too hard for you. But if you're really motivated, if you really want to listen to this podcast, that's great. And you'll have the transcript. So the transcript should help you if you read through it and look up all the new words, all the new phrases, and then listen to this podcast again. That would definitely be helpful for you. But ideally, this podcast is for people who are at a level where they can understand an unnatural scripted speech very easily, but they can't understand authentic native speech that is spoken at a real pace, at a real speed. If that's your level, this podcast is perfect for you. The reason I made this podcast for I'm making this podcast is to help students transitions between that really fake scriptive beginner listening practice type videos to real authentic content. So maybe you can understand American podcast made for American listeners, and but using the really artificial fake listening practice lessons that you find online or in paid program. Maybe though those are natural too easy for you and you need help transitions between those beginners level programs and real speed, right? So this podcast will be a podcast for you to transition to real speech. So I'm speaking without a script, okay? I didn't plan the word that I'm saying right now. I'm speaking spontaneously. So you're hearing me, Herson, speaking normally, just a little bit slower and a little bit more clearly. But the words to what I'm saying, the vocabulary I'm using, and all the things that I'm saying are normal for me. I'm not reading something right now. And that's what makes this podcast really useful is that I'm not writing scripts for it. If I write script and read it, you're not gonna hear authentic speed, right? I'm gonna read it, and that's not real speed. But if I do the podcast like this without a script, then you're gonna be able to hear what real speech sounds like, just in clearer and slower way, right? So that should be helpful for you, and I hope you find this type of talking, this type of audio useful. I know I do. When I learn other languages, I always search for podcasts or other audio like this, where it's native speaker who's speaking maybe a little bit more clearly than average native speaker. I use those videos, podcasts, audios to improve my listening when I'm learning other languages. So hopefully this will be a good tool for you to do that. So, as I mentioned before, this podcast is more for learners who are not ready for real content yet. If you have a very high level and you can understand real content, there's really no need for you to use this podcast. But of course, if you want to, you can listen. I'm happy to have you here listening to this podcast. So, in terms of how to use it exactly, or if you can passively. So, when I say actively, I mean that you sit down, you put your headphone in, pull up the transcript, and listen and do nothing else. That's active listening. Of course, that's fantastic. That's very helpful. If you can do that, right, that will be the most beneficial way to listen to this podcast. And when you do that, you can read the transcript or you can just listen to the podcast. It depends on how you want to use it, how much you understand, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But before that, I want to talk about passive listening. So if you don't have a bunch of free time, but you still want to practice your English listening, you can listen to this podcast passively. What does that mean? Well, while you're doing something else, for example, drive, work, washing dishes, cleaning the house, exercising, things like that, where you're doing one thing that your brain is free, you can use that time to listening to this podcast passively. You can use this podcast during that time, and of course, you won't be 100% focused on the podcast. You won't be 100 focused on what you're listening to, but you still be able to listening or learn new vocabularies, train your listening, etc. So you can listen to this podcast actively or passively or both. You probably have time or situations where you can do both in one day. So in terms of the transcript, right, you might ask, how do I use the transcript? Well, let me tell you how I use transcript when I do my listening practice when I learn languages. So, what I do is if I have transcript to an audio, I really read the transcript first and I look up any new words that I don't know, and then after that I listen to the audio with the scripts just if however if the audio is a level that someone easy for me, if it's not too difficult, or if the subject is very familiar to me, then sometimes I just listen to the podcast the first time without the transcript. I listen to the audio for the first time without reading it. You'll know based on their level how you can go about listening first time, right? If you have a higher level like B1, maybe you want to try to listening without scriptive listening, or you have a lower level like A2 level, maybe you'll want to start with the transcript. However, regardless of whether you use the transcript, whether you do like me or read the whole scriptive whole time before listening to the podcast, regardless of what you do, what I really recommend you to do is repeat. Listen to the same podcast episode multiple times. This is what I do when I practice my listening in other languages. I listen to the same audio three, four, five, even 10 times sometimes. And the reason I do this is because when you repeat an audio like that, or when you read something and again, what happens is that your brain starts to acquire the new vocabulary, the new phrases, the grammatical structures. Really, you don't even realize that it's happening, but it happens. When I do this repetition with my listening practice, I realize that I don't have to write down any new vocabulary. When I repeat the same audio 5 times, for example, by the end of the fifth time, I realize that I remember the new words. I remember the phrases. I can use new grammatical structures. I realize that my brain is capturing all this through the repetition. So now, when I do my listening practice, I never have to write the list of the vocabulary words. I never do that anymore. In the past, before I used this repetition technique, I always did that. I always have list of vocabularies. But now I don't. Now I remember all the new vocabulary, all the new phrases, as long as I repeat the same audio many times. So I recommend you listen to each episode multiple times, right? With transcript, without the script. With the way I do it, I just read the transcript with the script a couple times, and then I listen without transcript a couple times. This is extremely helpful for me, so I recommend this to you. And you might say, "Wow, it's a little boring to listen to this the same time, same thing." I understand that. Hopefully, interesting topic to talk about, so that it won't be too boring to repeat the same podcast. Hopefully, you'll like the topic that I choose, and it'll be everyday contemporary topics or other type of topics, but in general, hopefully that will be interesting. And you can always request new topics if you want me to talk a specific subject. So, lastly, let me talk about a little bit about myself. I'm Herson. I'm from California, and I love languages. I learned several languages. I'm not a polyglot. I wouldn't consider myself polyglot, but I speak English, of course, which is my native language, and I speak Spanish every day. I speak it fluently. I also speak Portuguese. I'm not a really advanced, but I can have conversation without any problem in Portuguese. And currently I learning French, and lastly I also learn Greek, and I can have very basic conversation in Greek, but I'm not focused on that language right now. But I'll definitely return to it in the future. So I love languages, and I'm a language learner just like you. And that's why it's fun for me to make this podcast because I like helping other people with their language learning. So I've been teaching English for many years now, my whole career, and currently I have a website called polyglossy.com. And on this website, I offer $1 seminars about different English topics. They're only $1 there, so they're very cheap, and each one is about 30 minutes. So it's a good deal, cheap, and you get 30 minutes of English. And I focus on most of the seminar of pronunciation and listening. These are the two elements that I'm most passionate about. I love teaching pronunciation, and I love helping English learner improve their listening. I'm really passionate about these two things, and I want to help everyone in these areas. So I also have seminars of some grammar topic as well, but most of the seminars are for listening and pronunciation. So if you need help in those areas, if you want more in-depth practice, I recommend you to go to polyglossa.com and sign up for those $1 seminar. Cheap and easy. I also have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/polyglossa, and on that channel I make a lot of videos about listening. So if you this podcast now for you to practice, if you want more practice, you can go to those YouTube videos, then listening to practice videos, and you can use them to train even more. I have videos for A1, A2, B1, B2, different levels. So that's a good resource for you if you want to practice your listening. And in terms of pronunciation, my Instagram account is more dedicated to that element. So Instagram username is at polyglossa languages. So you can check out that account and you'll find videos on pronunciation. I teach you how to pronounce the difficult words in English and some other elements of English as well. So yeah, those are all good resources for you to use online to improve your listening and your pronunciation in English. And of course, this podcast it will be focused on listening, and this will hopefully be your number one listening resource. So remember to check out polyglossa.com for those $1 seminars to train listening or pronunciation. And of course, come back for episode 2, the Listening Time podcast. Okay, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'll talk to you next time during the episode 2 of the Listening Time podcast.